something that we do. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Burns Hollyman. I'm the organizer of this meetup. This meetup group hasn't really, I mean, our focus is video games. The notion is it's about video game makers. We get a lot of different folks attend different sessions based on their interests. And we have regulars, and some of you are becoming regulars, so welcome again. And then you have stalwarts sitting in the Gordon Walton Chairman Emeritus seat over there is Gordon Walton.
10 minutes ago, I was Jimmy Swagger. Except I can't cry on the man.
From a fundraising perspective, in its better years, by the way.
Okay.
So the group sort of, there's no huge focus on it. There are a bunch of other groups that a number of us belong to. There's a Unity group, so if you're interested in Unity 3D, they serve beer at that one at Mr. Tramp's, and it's a huge, very, very popular meetup. There's a VR meetup, if you're interested in virtual reality, that we started and sort of spun out. So we're going to actually do a whole session on VR next month with Ghost Machine. But we tend to stay away from that stuff. Our focus is like, it seems to be, and we haven't really defined it, but let it develop organically, the business of the video game business, you know, and that can range from startups to, you know, very mature players in the marketplace to houses that do work for hire. We've had single studios, you know, Army of One studios, I call them. So what we do, come on in. Sit anywhere, there's tons of seats here. We haven't even started. So technically you're not late, you're early. So one of the things we do at the beginning, and it's all voluntary, we don't go around and you know, hi, I'm here to network, my name is Tanda. But what we do is ask people several things. One is, if you're looking for a job or you're looking to do something with someone, like I've got this game idea. I've got $1 million here I'd like to spend with someone in order to do that. Or more likely, I want to do this thing for free. People collaborate that way. And then there are people I just moved to town. I mean, there are people who come in here that literally dropped off the back of a truck 2 hours before and said, I'm looking for a job. So, and then the other thing we do is I'm looking for someone to help me with, right? So what I'd like to start with is, does anyone have something you're looking for, or, you know, looking for a job or looking for a project? You have something that, people gotten jobs out of this, by the way. We had someone get a.
If anybody has $1 million, they want to give me time. My name's Thomas, I'll take it.
And I'll work with you.
All right, yeah. We're already collaborating, I like this.
Is this value add for all of you or what? So, I'm not getting a lot of traction here.
Well, I'm in college and I'm a programmer, so if you want to take advantage of me, my programming skills, now is the time.
Oh,
And I'd be happy to jump on any projects right now.
So you Unity, C#?
Yeah, Unity and C# and Java.
Right.
Yeah, I'm a computer science major. So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I'm really open to like working on any project.
So instead of going into big data or four-dimensional, instead of going into as a computer science, instead of going to big data or any of the hot spaces, you decide to go, money-making spaces, you decide to go into games. Okay.
Yes. Pretty much.
Who's the guidance counselor at LSU? Okay, so that's great. I mean, someone contacted me recently and said, I don't know how to code, I don't know how to do artwork, but I want to do games. And I said, well, that's the definition of a producer. So, yeah, that's an enormous offer, huge, there are any takers. Anyone have jobs open or need people or resources or interns? I don't know, I'm looking at you, Gordon.
Yeah, I have a couple of a UI art and a visual effects artist position.
So those of you who don't know, last month we did Crowfall, which last time I looked, which was last month, I believe was number 15 in terms of Kickstarter's all-time game fundraising successful launches. And Gordon, who is an eminence Greece in the Austin video gaming community, and originally came from Origin, which is the origin of all people in the gaming industry. It seems like in Austin. Richard Garrett and a bunch of other people. So anyway, he started this new MMO, which was really interesting, not just because they're working with voxel technology, but it's called Crowfall, and as you probably know, the two segments that are growing the fastest now is Contrarian or PCs and MMOs are really going crazy. And there was an article, my wife actually, who has no clue about this whole world we're all in, ripped this thing out of the paper, and it was a little squib on there's 3 major MMOs here. If you count Cloud Imperium as an Austin company, which you technically can't, it's really Santa Monica, but they have a presence here. What Gordon's doing, then Richard Garriott, who's presented here, and I'm hoping we can have him back to do an update on Shroud of the Avatar. So anyway, that's what we're here to do. And by the way, on Meetup, you can email each other. I mean, it's sort of a geeky Facebook of sorts. I get messages from people all the time. So use Meetup and go to other meetups, and people tend to come to the meetings they're interested in. Then they're, as I said, regular attendees. Okay, so one of the things we stay away from the geek stuff, meaning the coding, because we don't want to compete with people that want to do deep dives on stuff like Unity. We've tried to be complementary, so we've stayed a little bit away from the mobile topics. We've had lots of mobile companies. We have Gumi in here. So anyway, today one of the big areas is of great interest to folks is always the creative side and the design side. And it seems like certain affinities had a lock on our speakers here. They keep, Fiona Cherek's given us some great leads for people to come in and talk about that whole side of the thing. Because you've got this right brain, left brain thing, like I'm a programmer, but it's games. Yeah. So tonight we have Neill Glancy, who's been doing this creative direction activity. He was creatively directing me on how to send the meetup announcements out. Use this artwork. You didn't send me that artwork. Fuck you, So you did it wrong. If you had the right artwork, I said, no, it's the top and the speaker. So anyway, instead of me getting something wrong, which I don't want to do to piss you off, what I'd like you to do is give a big applause to Neill, and I'd like you, Neill, actually to do your there's a lot of stuff on the road here, and you're going to get to see the world through the eyes of a creative director and more.
Thanks a lot, Burns. It's definitely a pleasure to be here and talk to you about some of the work I've done over the last 30 years in making video games. When I started making games, started making them on 8-bit machines, Sinclair Spectrums, things like that, pixel graphics, and went through a huge amount of material to put this presentation together. It's probably originally over 1,000 slides in the presentation, and I pared that down to about 520 slides, which covers about 5 or 6 generations of hardware. There's several stories in here of projects that you'll have never heard of, which hopefully you'll find interesting and entertaining. I'll try and provide a little bit of backstory on some of the projects and some of the unique production circumstances that surrounded some of the projects as well, just to add extra insight into why projects were scoped certain ways or why there are certain outcomes. Shall we begin?
It's all yours.
All right.
Until 9 o'clock.
So
we have to get everybody out of here.
hopefully the technology will actually behave itself and work. So just to give you an idea of how old some of this material is, I took this picture of one of my journals from DMA Design, and it's aged pretty horribly. In fact, some of the drawings that you'll see that are contained in this journal are quite yellowed with age. I've tried to keep a lot of documentation. I probably went through, if I put all of the books that I used to create the presentation on the table here, they'd probably be up to about here, physical documentation. And then, electronic documentation would probably touch the ceiling as well in terms of just filtering all this stuff. There's just such a staggering amount of work to go through. So having said that, because there is so much to go through, this is going to be a very, very fast-paced talk. We're going to be moving very, very quickly. There's lots of stuff to cover. So if you have any sort of attention deficit disorder, this is absolutely the best talk for you. So we'll kick things off here by talking about Walker, which was one of the first sort of bigger products I worked on with DMA Design. And the funny thing here is you can actually see this used to be a full screen image on an Amiga-esque platform. And if we look at a screenshot of the game, get this thing to work. There we go. There's a screenshot of Walker. It's a little bit hard to see, so I'll kind of blow it up a little bit in all of its pixel glory. But Walker was essentially a left-right scrolling shooting game where you piloted this walker with the keyboard, so you would move left and right on the keyboard, and you would use the mouse cursor to move the little reticule around, and you could target enemies on the ground or in the air or on buildings in the background. And there's an interesting backstory behind sort of how Walker came to be. Like most DMA products, there's always an interesting backstory. They had a kind of interesting creative process. But basically, where the game started was there was a very talented 3D programmer at DMA Design called Scott Johnson, who created a mathematical model of the walker's head inside the computer, and this is before any sort of real-time graphics existed. Rendering, I should say, had to be done frame at a time, and each render would take maybe 2 hours. And what he did was he programmed a model of this walker's head in 3D math, and then he created a program that would basically turn the model each frame so that the walker could look across, up and down, and all the variants, so up and across, an aim grid essentially is how we would refer to it now. And then with that sprite data, we then attached this sprite body to the walker, and we had this entity which looked like it had sort of three-dimensional presence. We also used a parallaxing system on the ground, so the ground was split into several layers so it appeared to kind of move in perspective as the screen moved left and right. So this kind of sort of period, I suppose, of design is what I would describe as the sketchbook and photocopy diagramming era. A lot of stuff that you made when you're communicating with teams was done by hand with pen, ink, pencils, color pencils, watercolors. And then you would have to take a scalpel, cut it out, rotate. Very like South Park, in fact. You would cut the pieces out and you would leave them, rotate them, and photocopy them, and then recolor composite them. It's a very sort of brute force approach. Walker was a relatively successful game for DMA Design. It wasn't a huge success like some of the other games we'd created, like Lemmings, which is a big international phenomenon. But it was still quite successful, and after we had completed the game, we decided we were going to make a sequel, which was called Project ABS. And we really wanted this game to address a lot of the shortcomings of the design of the first game. The first game was fun to play, and the mechanics felt natural and good, and it was fun to shoot things and blow stuff up. But one of the major shortcomings of the original game was just there was a real lack of variety. There was a variety of things to shoot, but there wasn't a variety of things to shoot them with, or ways you could kind of express your violence, as you might say. So we started ideation on this project, and here you can see an early illustration that I did of an alternate sort of version of the walker, which has all of these different kind of pieces on it. And we sort of brought in this idea that, hey, it would be fun if the player had some control over what they attached to the walker. So the idea of the walker being more of a frame with nodes that you could attach pieces to. And this idea was very, very ahead of its time. This is almost, oh gosh, 25-ish, 26-ish years ago. Now it's very common in video games to be able to customize your avatar, add armor, add weapons, and put a special sight on your gun and things like that. Back then, that just didn't exist. There was no concept of this whatsoever. So we were really kind of trying to push the envelope there. You can see also in this illustration that we had this notion that maybe we could have some sort of jump jets, so we could have some sort of vertical jumping, thrusting gameplay, maybe even some sort of light platforming elements there to make things more interesting. Here's a front view of the said scene. As part of figuring out this new project, we wanted to create a rich backstory. So we created a bunch of storyboards as to the sort of introduction of this story, and setting up the universe and the characters and the fiction and who the enemies were and things like that. And these are a selection of some of those storyboard panels. I'll just kind of flick through them so you guys can see that. Sorry, the caching's a bit slow.
So were these turned into like cinematic kind of cutscenes, pixel art kind of thing? Is that what they were?
They would have been.
Yeah.
They would have been had we gone into full production. But these were more to just communicate to the team, hey, here is the story, here's how the story could be presented, here's how it could be told. Here are the characters involved. And really just to sort of provide some more detail there. One other thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to kind of create these very epic, spectacular sort of boss moments. We did have boss moments in Walker. They were quite generational, I would say, in the sense that they followed a lot of archetypes that existed currently in the market, and by that I'm referring to things like Gradius. So large spaceship enters the screen, has lots of little guns on it that start raining bullets down on the player, stuff like that. And these were very popular idioms, but we really wanted to sort of push it further. How could we do these things with, even more spectacularly, even though the hardware was extremely limited? So I've got a couple of examples here I can share with you. So in this board, the walker would have basically entered this kind of portion of the street scene, having entered from screen right. And then, excuse me, there's this big explosion which reveals this tank in the background. And then the tank would sprite scale to the foreground, and then you would have this big kind of epic battle with this boss. And here you can see an illustration of that character, and then the walker here in the bottom corner. I also put a lot of Easter eggs in my drawings. I can't even begin to fathom how many drawings I've done across the course of my career. It must be tens of thousands at this point. But there's a little reference here on the tire to Dunlop. And Ian Dunlop was the creator, the programmer who created the Walker game. So there's always sort of little things nested in there. Here's another example of a boss intro. So in this case, the Walker had landed on a sort of unstable geological planet, and towards the end of the stage, they kind of get stopped in front of this big volcano. And there's these kind of volcanic bombs raining down on the player, and the player's avoiding these volcanic bombs. Pretty standard stuff. But then the volcano begins to shake and actually fracture, and pieces kind of fall off of it. And then we get this big UFO is revealed, which was actually hiding inside of the volcano. And we wanted to kind of add this rotation element, and I'll speak more about this rotation element in a little moment here. In fact, I'll talk about it now, because it's the next slide. So we called this the turntable concept. And the turntable concept was interesting. It's a little bit hard to see maybe for you guys in the back here, but what it really meant was, conventionally the walker was walking across the canvas, and the background was scrolling horizontally. But with the turntable concept, we thought, wow, wouldn't it be interesting if, as you were walking along at a certain point of that scroll, you continued to walk, but you were walking almost in place, because the world behind you was turning in a circle. And this would give you the ability to have a massive structure, like a boss, where you could actually now move around the back of that character, take out maybe a weak spot on the back, then keep walking around to the front, now you're attacking the front of it, and so on. It was an interesting concept. And it's not something I've really seen used since in games, so there's potential there if you want to steal that idea, go ahead. Here you can see a more elaborate illustration of the turntable concept. Here's the walker, this tiny, tiny little figure on the right here. And we can see the path as a dotted line around this large structure. Most of this thinking, with retrospect now, was technically impossible. It would have been extremely difficult to actually execute an idea like this. Not totally impossible, just very, very difficult, because all of these elements that we would be using to create the illusion of three-dimensionality as you moved around the object would have to actually be represented as flat sprite cards which were facing the camera. So as long as we use round primitive shapes, columns if you will, a column as it changes its orientation kind of looks the same because it's round, it doesn't have corners. So we were clever about stuff like that. But again, this is something that still hasn't really been explored in sort of side-scrolling shooters, and I still think it's a good idea. Here we have these little sort of nodes, these dots, where at a certain point along the progression, we might stop and lock the player into an area. Now they're scrolling left and right as normal, and they're having to deal with a very specific wave of combat, a challenge of obstacle avoidance or something similar to that. We have a lot of fun ideating on enemies as well. Enemies in the first game were really cannon fodder, lots of little guys running around. Sometimes they would be an armored vehicle. And we really wanted to do much, much better. So we spent a lot of time thinking about these enemies, and we spent a lot of time thinking about the enemies' behaviors. So we had, various different sort of ideas for characters, that you could have guys with, with dogs or in bases, you'd see scientists running around. Everybody loves shooting scientists. You know, guys that could come on buildings and jump onto the walker's head, and then you'd have to flick the mouse to kind of move the walker's head to actually throw them off, and then you could step on them. Everybody loves stepping on things. Laser guys, sniper guys, you know, all kinds of stuff. And then we had all kinds of, you know, vehicle ideas, heavy gun emplacements, tanks, bigger, heavier tanks, choppers, you know, guys with jetpacks that could kind of fly around and rain down damage. This particular enemy was a sort of spider-like sort of creature. It was fairly large. You can't quite see it here, but this is a charred body. You know, so here's kind of the scale of a person. So it's a fairly large critter. And the thing that was interesting with this thing was it could actually burrow into the ground and kind of submerge itself. So as you were walking along, you may actually see it in the buried state the first time the player ever encountered the character. And then it would emerge from the hole and the player would be like, holy shit, what's this? Almost a step down maybe from a sort of a mini-boss kind of concept. We wanted the characters to be able to sort of do interesting things in the world as well. You know, so rappelling down lines from buildings, but we wanted to build a bit of humour in there too. So there's this sort of Monty Python sort of notion that, hey, maybe sometimes when they rappel down, something was wrong and they fall and they splat. Here we can see an idea for a bunker gunner. So we have a guy who's kind of nested behind a series of sandbags. You're going to put some damage on that sandbag, break it apart, and the guy's going to leap forward and he's, you know, holding the gun, you know, railing the player with that. Here we see an example of what we call rolling men. And again, this is very, very ahead of its time, this thinking, because what we're really talking about here in modern design terms is what's called aim avoidance. In FPS games, aim avoidance is a core component of enemy behavior, meaning simply if I point my gun at you, then the AI is informed that the gun is pointing at it and it will, you know, step or roll or jump out of the way. And this was this notion that we were incorporating here because obviously the player was moving a cursor around the screen, so it was easy for us to tell how the cursor's pointing at the sky. Let's have him, you know, side barrel roll out the way. Mad bombers, you know, guys with explosives that would jump off of buildings or chase you around the place. We had some psychos, you know, guys that were very, very hard to kill, that when you killed them and they fell down dead and you thought they were dead, they would suddenly revive because they were psychos. And, you know, guys who hide barrels because people hide barrels apparently. Here you can see another illustration, again sort of indicating this modular concept, this idea that, hey, you could stick this turret on here, or maybe this piece attaches here. We were playing around with lots of different sort of visual ideas for, you know, what could the walker look like, how could we make it look more interesting. So I'll switch over to some level design stuff here. Designs started off very, very high level. So usually a couple of pages on a pad indicating sort of a few screens of crawl. And then once we kind of, you know, got buy-in on those ideas, then we would kind of develop more detailed plans. Here we can see the walker being sort of parachute dropped into this ice shelf at sort of a polar level, thus the penguins. And we also wanted to incorporate this idea that there could be interaction from background to foreground, as opposed to just enemies entering within the 2D plane or being present on the background in a building, that the characters could be seen in the distance as small objects and then move towards the screen, which are represented here by very badly drawn snowmobiles. Here we can see the page just to the left of that leaf where the walker's moving along and then it falls dramatically and unexpectedly into a cave. Now it's proceeding through a cave where it meets an ice wall, and the player then kind of opens up on that ice wall with their weapons, enters through the ice wall and enters into this big, big cave, which contains this sort of big, massive UFO. Apparently UFOs were all the rage back then. Here we can see, this is kind of the next sort of step of detailing. So this is a much more detailed map. In fact, this diagram is probably about 5 feet long. If I folded the document out on a table, it's made of many, many sheets. The idea being, the walker would have a drop insertion point, it would break through this chain link fence, and it would proceed, you know, past this obstacle course of enemies and gadgets. And if we push over to the next screen here, You can see there's a big base, and the base would be on alert. All these sirens are going off. These garage doors are rolling up. The weapons are all turning to present and dial in the player's position. Aircraft are taking off from these landing pads and then moving into the foreground and dropping bombs on the players are doing what have you. Again, pushing further into the base, leaving the base now and meeting an intersection of road. We've got a police roadblock, lots of cops to blow up. Everybody loves blowing up cops. In games. Entering a naval base, you can see just a little bit of a hint of a sort of nuclear submarine there on the left. Proceeding forward again. Here we can see an illustration of a kind of God view of that world, and everything I just showed you fits into this area. In fact, I think I have a slide that shows you that a little bit more detail. Yeah, there you go. So that little tiny, that big 5-foot scroll kind of fits into this little section here. And we would use these kind of bigger maps just to figure out things like, tone, proportion, size, scale, color, background, atmosphere, as well as just thinking about the size and shapes of things and the sense of presence. And then at the end there was this big crazy windmill thing. I don't know what I was thinking or smoking when I drew that. Mission planning. Again with this story, we did want the story to be, to make some sense. I know that's not really a staple in video games, generally speaking, especially back then. We didn't really have much of a story. So we created this solar system with these planets, with these factions, and we would use these sheets to plan out the progression of the campaign. So the player starts here, and then they beat this stage, and then they fly to this other planet, and then they beat this other stage. Now this alien faction enters the solar system unexpectedly, and now they are a player in the story. So there's lots and lots of sheets like that we produced, but I just pulled the one in because they're kind of boring. One other element that we wanted to build in was this idea of sort of player progression via an economy. And again, this was quite a sort of forward-thinking idea. Now it's very, very commonplace. I have a car, I go into races, I earn money, I pour that money back into my car to make my car better, sexier, faster, what have you. But back then, this was, nobody was doing this kind of stuff. And it kind of makes sense why people weren't doing those things back then, because memory constraints were very, very tight, and you had to implement multiple variants graphically of different models to support this choice of the player. But, this was something we were entertaining anyway. So there's this notion that, maybe you start off at this kind of mom and pop scale, sort of, guns for hire kind of business, and as you complete more missions, then you can, grow your business into this much larger kind of facility. Maybe within such a facility, you could even have multiple walkers that you configured for different missions or different kind of choices of gadgets and so on. We spent a lot of time, thinking about the characters and mechanics of things in the world, creatures and stuff, and no detail was really too small. So we spent a fair amount of time just thinking about things like how do the walkers' legs work, and how do they articulate, and how do they move, and it was important to us to make things make sense. And when I look back on this now, one of my big sort of takeaways looking back on this work is, wow, we really had the luxury of time. Because back then the teams were very, very small, and durations of projects were generally quite long, because it was a very sort of slow, casual-paced sort of development environment. Whereas today, people expect you to actually be productive. But here's another example of this kind of weird nomadic sort of snow beast thing that was going to sort of roam around the snowlands, and we didn't think about things like, well, how would its feet work, and how would it not sink into the snow if it's so big, and so on. Here's another example, sort of again illustrating this kind of turning principle, where the camera would be following the player down this street, but then to add a bit of sort of surprise and delight, we then pivot the camera around and proceed up in this direction. Again, just to sort of break up the action and make it a little bit more interesting, give the player a bit of a surprise. And even though that was a perspective shift, I should say, with block structures, I did a lot of experimental work back in the day to simulate textured geometry objects moving in perspective without 3D compute power. And what I mean by that is I would generate the facades of the buildings in bitmap graphics, and then I would use perspective distortion to generate each frame of that face as it turned in front of the camera. And by adding multiple cards to that model, I could construct a complex geometrical object with textures before texturing geometry hardware existed. Another sort of fun thing we did was we let the team sort of play around with ideas for sort of decaling. Once we were kind of getting a bit closer to some ideas of what this character could look like, we sort of did this paint by, it's not paint by number, it's like a colouring book, like a children's colouring book. So we had these kind of monochromatic sort of outlines, and then we let people go in and draw camouflage and decals and stickers, so that we could look at all the different ways that people thought we might want to customize their character and how that might look. We spent a lot of time thinking about weapons. Again, as I mentioned before, the weapon selection in the first game, there just really wasn't any. So this was something that we really wanted to fix. Again, just sort of talking about the mounting points. I'm going to go through these real quick. But there's a laser system that you can have. This laser system has 3 different fire modes, so sort of a little kind of pinprick attacks, or you could hold down a button to sort of do a more sustained, long sort of beam attack. Sort of pellet munition launchers that could fire incendiary pellets, smoke pellets, explosive pellets. This one looks like just some sort of missile launcher. My eyes are getting bad, I'm getting old. Lasers, so again, multiple salvos, different beams. One of my personal favorites, the microwave gun. So you would have this microwave gun, and you would basically have to sort of point it at an enemy, so you've got the sort of infantryman on the ground, and bang, shoot at your walker. And then you'd sort of start getting itchy. And and his hair would kind of go on fire, and he'd start running around, because he's all getting cooked. And then, of course, you get the nice little sort of bang, the microwave oven sort of bang, it's toasted, and then poof, the kind of top. This was pre-Fargo. This was so this was a vacuum weapon where you just kind of hoover these guys up, and these jibs would fly at the back of your wall. Yeah, you could tell we were sort of teenagers back then. A sort of bomblet spinning thing that would sort of throw munitions all around in all sorts of different directions. This one was a nod to a cure. This was a satellite uplink. So you would basically call in a satellite strike. You can see there's a small representation of a rocket here, an explosion. And you can see in these illustrations, these are all pixel-based illustrations. So sometimes when you had to do work that fit together, it needed to be produced with illustrative rigor, so the pieces could be assembled back together. And that'll make a bit more sense as we get further in. But doing pixel work like this for these kind of illustrations was very time consuming, as you can imagine. Another one of my personal favorites, this sort of a tube launcher. The thing about this one was you'd fire these sort of tubes out the back, and they would land in the battlefield like a sort of big bullet. And then a door would open and a Terminator would get out. And then this Terminator would basically walk around the battlefield killing all the other little minions. And then, spiders. Spiders are awesome. Especially when they're attacking other people. So this comes back a little bit to that rigor comment from before. So part of this other concept was sort of relating to customization, was this idea that as you played the game and earned money, you could buy these modules. And these modules sort of slotted, like, I suppose like a server rack maybe would be a good metaphor. They slotted into these kind of connection points. So you could kind of pull a module out, between missions, you could put another one in. You could configure the module by clicking on certain buttons. Some of these panels have quite detailed sort of, sliders, buttons, things like that to let you configure it. And when you were sort of fully loaded, you might see something like this. And this would let the player have a really good level of control over how they wanted to play the game. And again, this was a very revolutionary concept at the time, because again, people weren't really doing this kind of stuff. So we'll switch tracks. away from Walker and talk a little bit about working with Rockstar. So in early 1993, Rockstar had just formed a studio in New York, and they approached David Jones at D&D Design for a collaboration, to ideate on a collaboration. And at that time, Rockstar consisted of basically two people. I believe it was Dan, and I can't remember the other chap's name, Dan Hauser, another chap. And their strategy, their sort of business strategy was, we have gone to the music industry and acquired the music rights to generations of music libraries, 60s, 70s, 80s, early 90s. And we have locked down rights to use this music in the context of video game. That's kind of our business plan. So, and this all makes sense when you think about GTA, right? Everybody loves the radio stations, the music. That's kind of where that part of it kind of came from. But before GTA came along, they were curious, we've got all this music stuff, what the hell are we going to do with it? So Dave said to me, he's like, hey, think about this Rockstar thing, can we think about a music game? Can we make a music game, a game that's all driven around music? So, one of the things that obviously we needed to do to begin with was just think about, well, who are these characters and what can they do? So we went away and did a few sort of illustrations, of these different sort of characters and their personalities. I'm not very good at drawing people, just, here's some sort of crazy drummer dude. And then, the world would be these other sort of extra characters, friends, confidants, neighbors, business partners, and so on, that you would meet in this world of this game. Yeah, some of these drawings are quite amusing. The neighbors who are always getting bothered by your loud practice sessions. The pub landlord. And the idea was that, you would start off as a small, sort of scrappy band, and you would sort of work your way up to the top. And the sort of landlady there. The bouncers, the roadies, that drunk guy who's always in the corner complaining about stuff. And then you'd have the police, of course. Gotta poke fun at them. And locations. So, you would play these sort of musical sets in these locations, and again, as you performed better, you would score higher, which means you would have more fans, more revenue, and you would be performing at sort of bigger and bigger venues as the game sort of progressed. And it's funny looking back on all this stuff now through the lens of Rock Band, right?
Yes.
Because Rock Band would come 15 to 20 years later. It was quite a long time after. So it's interesting to kind of see how that take on music kind of changed, especially when we were just working with a Genesis control pad in this instance versus thinking about plastic guitars and stuff like that. Don't get me wrong, I think Rock Band's awesome, I love it. Here's some extremely blurry pictures of our controller ideation. One thing that I thought was very funny was this, when I was reviewing this, Call's Roadie button. So there must have been some idea that you could, be doing something and your guitar broke or came unplugged. I can't remember what I was thinking at the time. I thought it was kind of interesting. And then, there was this idea that you would be entering sort of on-tempo music components, but that your physical performance was a big part of what made you great, not just being able to play on time. The way you physically presented the music on stage was part of the game loop, and it was a critical part of scoring. So here we see an example of a guitar player standing at sort of neutral stance, but if I tap that joypad up, the player is playing the guitar. So instead of playing like this, ding, 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 and if I push up on the D-pad again, now I'm playing it behind my head. Looking at the sort of down, here's neutral, so see if this is going to catch up. So, you could be up on tempo, down on tempo, up on tempo, down on tempo, up on tempo, down on tempo, over the head, You could kind of string all these things together in a very simple way to kind of create and push down the game, or you can lean there, and it would sound just like that.
Can you smash your guitar?
I don't know, probably. I think there's some note in here about broken instruments, but I can't remember. joypad less, so you're playing in the neutral stance, now you're kind of leaning over again, you could be doing this in time with the music and stuff like that. And maybe if you went a little bit more over, you could do an even more extreme pose. And the idea was that, hey, maybe you learn new moves along the way, maybe you earn new moves along the way, maybe the move chain gets deeper and more complex, so there's more ability to add expression. So that is everything I have on the Rockstar game. So, meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in America, after I left Scotland, I worked with Iguana Entertainment on Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel, which was a Sunsoft game built on SNES and Genesis hardware, which was an 8-way scrolling platform game with this very bizarre character. Lots of lovely blocky graphics to look at here. And it consisted of platforming, but also these kind of sort of vehicle stages. Here's a quick look at the extremely complicated controls. It's funny when you look at that now compared to, say, a PlayStation 3 or 4 controller with shoulder buttons and pressure sensitivity and trackpads, and didn't have any of that right then. And we would do these kind of little scripts for enemy behaviors in terms of, well, here's this enemy, here's what he does when the player tries to attack him. This is how he defends himself, and this is how he becomes vulnerable and how you can beat him and such. So we produced lots and lots of these little diagrams. And we would use these diagrams to work with the art and the programming team to actually implement the moves and how the characters would come to life inside the system. Here we can see an example of some vehicle action. One of the moves the character could perform was a multi-turn fall. So basically, you could jump off an edge, and as opposed to jumping off the edge and just going, you could jump off the edge and fall, and then turn again. So you could kind of cover large distances with skill, if you had the skill to do it. With retrospect, one of the things that we got wrong about this mechanic was it was just a bit too hard to pull off. But that was very common at that time in video game design thinking. As I'm sure you're all aware, when we look at game design now, games generally speaking are extremely forgiving now, or more casual, as you might say, versus back then things like Ghosts and Goblins. It's like you would play for 10 minutes, and if you died, you're right back at the beginning and just kicking the machine and swearing at it. I came across these pencil sketches when I was going through the archive as well. I thought these were quite amusing. I hadn't seen them for a long time. And these were some ideas for these sort of ant characters. There's a stage in the game where you're playing in this cliff level. We have these various arrow markers that would indicate to the player, hey, here's the flow of the level, here's where you need to be going. But the idea was you could have these ant characters that were probably about 4 to 6 pixels each. And they would basically be these kind of agents of mischief. So in the top, we can see the ants creating a stack of ants and then pushing the arrow and changing its direction. Or here we see the player grabbing onto the chain of ants and swinging over, using them as a kind of rope, which is funny because I believe the Woody Allen CG film Ants, they had stuff like that in it. It's probably obvious. Here we had ants on top of a ridge throwing stones down at the player. Throwing larger sort of obstacles at the player. Player could be down at the bottom here, the ants are at the top, you push a boulder which starts to roll down and cause problems. Here the ants are holding a boulder, they'd be sort of holding it up here and chained, and as the player approaches they would swing down holding onto the boulder, and then they would let go of the boulder and it would release and splat the player in a very satisfying, splatty way. So, as part of ideating on level design, and this is kind of, I suppose, more of a personal thing for me, but when I think about designing levels, I'm not just thinking about jump distances, fall heights, fall damage, how far things are apart, how difficult they are, but I'm also trying to think about what is the feeling that we're trying to evoke in this space. So, as anyone who's worked with me, Michael will know well, and Maggie, I like to do lots of drawings of what the tone and the feeling of the space is, because when you explore some of those topics as a designer, you often find things that aren't obvious but that are deeply interesting, and you can roll them back into your design. So, I would sort of produce all these different drawings and ideas and elements of, here's how we could depict rocks. And a lot of this, again, was pushing the technology at the time because sprite graphics at that time were assembled like Lego pieces. You had to kind of fit and clip them together and they had to fit on a grid. So you didn't really see objects like this very much in games of that era where you had a large amount of sprite acreage dedicated to a unique image. Here we see a diagram of one of the vehicle stages. And another sort of vehicle interaction here, landing on a log with lumberjacks. Lumberjacks are known to be evil. This was one of the bosses in the game, this sort of tree harvester, this big machine that would sort of fly over the forest and, excuse me, the player would be very, very small. And it would sort of uproot and drop these trees and generally be sort of a menace. Here you can see another example of that. Another little doodle about vehicle interactions, this time talking about the orientation of jumps. Here we can see the barrel is a nice angle for the player to leap off of it. Here the barrel is in the opposite direction, causing an ejection, which again nowadays you probably wouldn't do that because it would be a little bit too hardcore, too punishing. A diagram doodle of sort of the internal structure of a lumber mill factory, and this level actually is in the game. And this is this next stage. Here we had the wood essentially being pulped and then turned into paper. So these are all big paper rollers, and the paper's kind of flowing over and under these elements, and then the player is riding over these elements like sort of very high-speed conveyors, and that also made it into the game. It's hard to tell. It's a bit hard to see this one. This was a little diagram of one of the forest stages where you're climbing up these sort of giant redwoods and moving through them. And this was part of the very first stage of the game, part of the beach sequence. Obviously did a lot of stuff on grade paper back then too. With the sprite stuff, things had to fit together, and you knew your jump distances and jump heights, so you could really create fairly viable level plans on paper. The caution I would use for using this technique now, although it is a proven technique, is it's never quite true in reality. I've actually used this technique relatively recently in one of the projects I worked with for Disney. And even with 20 years plus experience reapplying this technique in that scenario, it was still interesting to see that although the technique worked well in some situations, it still had flaws. But it did allow you to kind of gauge the grand scope of an area and generally figure out, is this going to be too hard or too easy? Here you can see a bit of the same diagram folded out. Some of these layouts would be very large and span multiple pages. And this was kind of more of an overview level where we could see, the beach and the cliffs, tunnels, and sort of overworld. I think sort of again, Ghosts and Goblins, how you would see that map of the entire kind of journey of the entire game. This is just an example of sprite block design. So the object on the left, which is kind of the desired result, is made out exclusively of the pieces that you see on the right. So just by being fairly rigorous about what pieces you really need, you can actually create a lot of different shapes and interest in the rocks so that it seems fairly unique as the player's traveling over it. Character designs, these drawings are illustrating the main sort of principal attacks and motions of the character. Jumping, double jumping, spinning. The character had a move where they could sort of jump in the air and then they could kind of sort of slam down in an arc and kind of punch an enemy and kind of knock them back very powerfully off cliffs and so on. This was a sort of flick-flack kind of maneuver where the player could kind of jump onto their hands and then off their hands onto their feet and onto their hands. And every time they performed this move, the distance they would travel would become greater. Again, the idea seemed good, but when we implemented it into the game, it didn't really work too well. It was just a little bit too complex. We had a number of different sort of epilogues for the game and different ways and ideas for the game to end. Here we see the player character has escaped on this tree harvester thing, but then, oh no, giant robotic lobster thing They're very common apparently. Comes out of the water, so it grabs the player and pulls them sort of under the water to be continued start. In this second variety, same sort of start, but this big sort of metallic sort of clown head, which was the big bad guy, had this kind of clown appearance, surfaces out of the water and then fires this magnetic nose at the ship, capturing it, ratcheting it back in, pulling it in, and then submerging beneath the water. So there we go, that's some Zero stuff. So around this time, in terms of design illustration, things were pivoting a little bit away from the conventional paper, illustrated, cut stuff out, photocopy it a million times, because the image would just degrade. Every time you photocopied stuff, it just gets more washy and washy. So I started to do a lot more diagramming with vector-based illustration. And these illustrations were all done in Word, which is not exactly an art tool, as I'm sure you guys know. But you'd be surprised what you can actually do with Word. So one of the games that we did after Zero was this N64 game called Iggy's Wrecking Balls. It's a super, super fun platformer. They even made a Japanese, we even did a Japanese version of it, which was making it its size bigger, and they localized all the speech and stuff. But essentially it was this kind of 2D, 3D sort of platformer. So as the player progresses around this path, the world turns, and the player can move up these different elements. And it featured these sort of grapple mechanics that we'll get into in a moment here. But it was also a sort of multiplayer versus and co-op game, so you could have up to 4 players playing at once. But you would basically kind of ascend these towers of rings by grappling and pulling yourself up, and moving around and grappling and pulling yourself up. And when you were doing this with friends, it was fun, right? Because although the mechanic was simple, it was the fact that you were trying to be faster than your friends. And you could also sabotage them along the way as well. There would also be these kind of sort of connecting segments, these pieces that would sort of connect these ring clusters together to provide sort of alternate paths with different gadgets on them and stuff like that. And there was a lot of different characters in the game. There was the sort of standard character, this Charlie character, was like a sort of blue ball. And then there was this sunny character who had he was the sun, so he had this nice kind of bright yellow, warm, glowing effect to him. The company was iguana, so he had this Iggy character that was an iguana kind of head. There was a lot of different ones. There was a snowman head, a pumpkin head guy. This is an example of a state diagram for the characters, just showing the different moves and states the character could enter and how those states link to other states. So one of the principal mechanics was this grapple, as I've said. You could use the grapple to get around the world, but you could also use it to attack enemies. So you could fire the grapple horizontally ahead of you, and if it connected with an enemy, it would kind of dizzy them for a moment. But you could also, if you held the button down, you could grab them, dizzy them, and pull them back, and from there you could enter many other different states and moves that we'll get into in just a moment here. If you jumped up and then grappled, you would then use the analog stick to build up a swing. And this momentum is what you would use and then release to pass through the platform and land above. Here we can see an example where, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, it was very interesting trying to teach players this technique, but this is a fairly standard traversal distance. So a player when jumping could grapple onto this element and then be pulled up. But in this case, this is too far. The player cannot jump and grapple this distance. So what the player had to do was, on the platform, they had to grapple down, and they would dangle below and swing up and through the platform, and as they got thrown up, they would then grapple again and pull themselves up. So there was quite a lot of depth, considering the mechanics were actually quite simple. There was a lot of skill that you could get a lot of bang for your buck from the design sense out of just a simple toolkit, which is again just a good concept just for a good, solid, robust design. I often think of it as letters of the alphabet. Mechanic A plus mechanic B equals mechanic C. Mechanic B plus mechanic A in reverse order equals mechanic D. So if you think about how to combine simple jigsaw gameplay building blocks together in different linear sequences, they can lead to different outputs of skill and discovery for players, and players love discovering stuff. This was, I believe, one of our craziest ideas, which was the idea of, hey, what if two players could be attached to each other? So you've got one person dangling, and then another person attaches to the dangling person, and then you've got this crazy, spastic, swingy thing, And we thought this was a great idea. Here you can see an example of two connected players jumping off onto a spike, whereby they generate an elastic bounce, which bounces them up to a higher height. This would have been a total, excuse my language, fucking nightmare. There's just no way this would have worked. But we thought we were super clever, like, this is going to be great, it's going to be great. We didn't do that in the game I went at. So internals, we had lots of internals, and there's going to be a few things here that you'll see, you'll recognize. Your standard kind of in-out obstacles. You've got some sort of pendulum thing that's moving in or out, and there it is. In the way of it, that's kind of like a wrecking ball, right? It's going to knock you off the level. It's going to knock you down. Turrets, stuff that shoots at you. Air currents you could jump into that would blow you up. Little blocks that the player could manipulate. They could kind of pull blocks out and then kind of create little staircases and things. Round sort of turning hole elements that you could kind of jump on and then grapple up between the different elements. Tubes, a lot of these things are very inspired by Marble Madness. I don't know if you guys are very familiar with Marble Madness. Definitely one of my top 10 sort of all-time arcade games. Just such unique art style. Very, very beautifully rendered, considering the limitations of the hardware, and very imaginative, very creative. So we stole all that stuff. Hammers that would, hammer you out the way. And here's a real Marble Madness lift. This rotating drum. So the player, if they jumped on this and they sort of stood or even just walked or bounced over it slowly, they'd be turned off and would fall into one of these funnels. So you had to keep kind of jumping constantly to kind of get across this obstacle. Another classic sort of Marble Madness lift, the vacuum thing that would sort of suck you up and pull you off course. We had a fairly wide variety of different enemies. They all sort of fall into basic categories. The annoying jerk character, the one that sort of is more of a nuisance that bumps and pushes you back and it's just a pain in the ass. The guy that has a seemingly sort of a limitless number of eyeballs that you can fire in. Here we have some little birdie things that were like kind of airbags that you could jump on and they would sort of puff and bounce you up to higher levels.
Proto Angry Birds look there.
Right. I should see them!
Yeah.
So boss encounters, we had lots of great ideas for boss encounters, and I'll show you a few, but I'll just go over some of the basic combat mechanics in a little bit more detail so you can understand. So, having fired my grapple at the enemy and attached to them, I could then use the analog stick on the N64 controller if I was pushing to the right to spear the enemy in this direction and attach to them. Once the attach happened, I could jam that stick to the left and I would slam them on the ground over my head in an arc. Which you see here. Or, upon attachment to the enemy, if I did a rotary motion with the analog stick, I could grab the enemy and then start spinning him round in circles, and then throw him off in a crazy direction. You could grab an enemy, pull him towards you where he would get kind of bounced on your head, and then you could throw him off. So there was a number of different little kind of combat abilities that were fun and discoverable and let you do different things and interact with the enemies in different ways. And this is obviously even more fun when you're doing it to your friend. If you've got a friend who's next to you and you're like, yeah, take that, motherfucker. And they're just like, rage quitting. So here's some early boss ideas that we had. And this is a fairly straightforward example, but you know, I spear the boss, I do the overhead slam into the spikes. Here we have a tube full of fire, as tubes are wont to get, and I spear the boss, I spin him in a circle, and I use release timing to throw him into the vent. Sorry, the slides are a bit slow to cache. What's going on here? Okay, so here I spear the character, and on top of him, I roll him into the plunger, which then fires him rapidly around the ring into the spikes, damaging him. In this example, we see 4 players playing collaboratively against the boss. 3 players are standing on an area in the middle of the level. The 4th player is in the back right corner, standing next to a plunger device, which would just kind of fire the player up into the air. So the 3 players standing in the foreground are luring the boss to that position. When the boss moves to that position, the player on the back would jump on this bouncer, which would cause them to fly up and land on the other end of what would be revealed to be a seesaw. And that would cause the boss to be thrown into the wall, and he would take damage. This, I believe, I can't quite remember because I'm old, it was a very long time ago, but I seem to remember this character was the game's intended final boss. So this guy would throw these kind of spiked enemies into the level, and then the players would grapple attach to these enemies, and they would start spinning them around in a circle, and they would release and throw them into the enemy, which would break one of his teeth. And having a couple of his teeth broken, the boss would retreat, being all pissed off about his dental damage, and fly over your head and kind of do these sort of lightning strike attacks on the ground that the players would have to avoid. Then he would return, similar thing again, sort of rinse, repeat, gathering the things, spinning them around, throwing them at the boss, damaging him, until eventually he is destroyed. So level design was an interesting challenge for Wrecking Balls because the levels were these kind of circular areas. It's very hard on paper to conceptualize that, especially in a bulk way, because we wanted to do 100 levels in the game, which was very ambitious to produce so much content. But we did a lot of diligence at the start of the project to be able to understand what made things easy, what made things medium, what made them hard, what made them very hard. We essentially created an economy, kind of a cost per internal, where we could realize that certain levels that used certain internals or enemies had a higher cost. Therefore, they were inherently going to be more difficult. And when I would hand assignments to the level designers to execute, the assignment wouldn't be, here's a diagram of a level, go and build it. The assignment would be, here's the shopping list of items you can use. You can use them any way you like, but these are the items you can use. Because by using that constrained list of items, we knew that that level would fall into the easy bucket, or the medium bucket, or the hard bucket. And we also did a lot of testing along the way as well, where we would gather feedback from play sessions. So we had this big, long sort of playlist, as you might say, of 100 levels. And we would constantly kind of pull levels out and then move them down into 2 levels or move this one up 3 levels, just to get that difficulty ramp just right. But we spent a lot of time really thinking about this stuff because we really wanted the game to be very accessible. And you know, there's just reams and reams and reams of this stuff. But it did pay big dividends. It was definitely very, very helpful. So, pivoting sort of from sort of vector diagramming to the 3D geometry era. So this was a very interesting transition in the industry as we went from, hey, everything is sprite-based games to Okay, now we can render polygons. And as soon as we could make games in 3D, there was all kinds of new challenges about how do you design such games, how do you communicate the design of such games. A lot of our design language and technique that we used to express creative to teams was now irrelevant because it was kind of siloed in this 2D language. We had to evolve our communication style into this 3D language. And I have some examples here, a few examples from the Turok franchise. I worked on several of the Turok games in different capacities, helping them out as they were starting making the product. I was actually working on a couple of other projects when we were ideating some of the Turok stuff, but some of these diagrams give you some ideas. So here we see a word-based vector diagram illustrating perspective of three-dimensional geometry scene. So this was my solution basically to how do you communicate three-dimensional, or even understand as a designer, what 3 dimensions could mean to the player and to action and design. And in this case, the player, Turok was an FPS of course, would enter from this high area, and there was this, I believe it was lava or something, or a fast flowing river or something. That's certainly death basically if you went in the water or the lava. And there was these floating little sort of islandy things. So you could jump onto one of these things and you would have to ride it right to the brink, where you would then jump off and attach to a zip line down into the lower area for safety. But there was, this sense of, wow, there's a whole new language that we need to develop to be able to talk about this stuff. Didn't mean that 2D had gone away, as we can see here. And it's funny looking at this because this is exactly the same technique that Bungie uses when they visualize entire world sections. They'll draw the entire world as a cross section for, say, 2 or 3 hours of gameplay. Just so we could get a sense of, hey, you're going to start high, go through a bunch of cave stuff, then you're going to go down here, it's going to be flooded underwater, this is all an underwater progression, and so on. Here's some other examples of 3-dimensional visualization using 2-dimensional polygons. So these are all just literally vector primitives, just rendered, drawn isometrically, just by placing each polygon individually. And I had a bit of an advantage in some of this stuff because in Scotland, one of the things that I trained to do when I was at school in Scotland was technical illustration, so industrial illustration, designing sort of nuts and bolts and engines, lots of complex cutaway diagrams and things like that. So this kind of getting myself into this headspace to do this stuff wasn't too difficult. But this was a huge challenge for the industry as a whole to understand 3D and what it meant. And oh my God, we have a camera, and now the camera can move in 3D, and how the hell we're going to get that thing to work. Not so much an issue with FPSs, of course. But again, here you can see some more examples. And then, there came a point in complexity where 3-dimensional geometric mimicry wasn't enough. We were talking about content that was beyond my scope to execute as a mimicked 3D model. So I had to learn how to actually use real 3D tools. And in this case, I learned how to use, at the time, which was one of the only solutions that was relatively affordable, was 3D Studio Max. So we would use 3D Studio Max to kind of block out these different levels and areas, and you'll have to excuse me, I know some of these images are very difficult to interpret and to understand what the hell is going on. But we would use, we would actually create these sort of blockouts or grey box layouts, as you might say, in Max to kind of illustrate some of these points. We would still use, the old style for some of the more simple diagrams, but for these more complex layouts, it really required, having real geometry in 3D, being able to move the camera around a little bit. And we would do alternate shadings, and you can see the photocopy obviously here is showing its age a little bit, but you can see again that sort of skeletal geometry. So I've taken a frame from Max, unshaded, unlit, and then I've actually inked in the paths with a pen, and then I've gone and re-rendered that scene in 3D with lighting so the imagery makes a little bit more sense. So we'd kind of see the left and the right image together. Here's some more examples. Kind of doesn't make so much sense, but when you see that, it makes a little bit more sense.
Like the label at the bottom, death.
Lava or death.
Yeah.
At least you got some options.
Precursor. It's like a precursor to Mortal Kombat, with the spike pit and all the heads and all that. So again, it just makes a little bit more sense when you see that shaded view. But we needed the unshaded view to be able to describe, well, this is what the player's doing, And one of the things that we really struggled with a lot back then was trying to not make stuff too difficult, because Turok was one of the first FPS games that had real 3D geometry with jumping and gaps and navigation and such. And we hadn't discovered at that time that first-person platforming is really fucking hard. So we're thinking we're all being totally clever clogs. Oh, this is gonna be awesome. People are gonna love this. People were screaming, pulling their hair out. They're like, "This is impossible. You're killing me here. This is just so difficult." So again, there was just tons and tons to learn about this whole new realm of making things in 3D, what 3D meant, how far away things could be from the camera. The clip plane was very close. If you look back to Turok 1 now, that clip plane is probably about just a little bit further than that doorway, because we simply did not have the polygon budget to render long draw distances. Especially if we wanted to render complex objects like dinosaurs, which was the whole point, right? Because we wanted to have these dinosaurs. So pivoting away from some of the 3D stuff, I also did some work with Mark Cassini, who would later move on to Retro Games and work on the Metroid series on Turok Rage Wars. And one of the things that we wanted to do with Turok Rage Wars, which was a multiplayer focused game, it was not a single player campaign based game, it was all focused around team play playing together via 4-player local split screen, was this idea that we could make these little kind of stage boxes, and depending on the winning conditions of the match, maybe a door on the left of the map opened, or a door on the back of the map opened, or a door on the right of the map opened. And that would then lead you through to a different area. And the idea was that, hey, by doing such a thing, we could create these kind of unique play paths that people could replay the game over and over again to try and unlock different kind of paths through the content. So flip over to the next project. So the next project we worked on was Batman Forever, and this was a very, very long, complex, interesting, very challenging project. So we started off, we were going to make this game for the Sega CD system. And the first prototype we did, unfortunately I don't have any material left to show you of what this first prototype looked like. But the idea was, let's do this kind of Smash TV based idiom where we're looking down into an area of Gotham. You can see the Batmobile enter the scene, Batman and Robin jump out, and there's all these thugs, and everybody loved Smash TV back then. It was a lot of fun. The only concern that we really had with this approach was, well, yeah, we know this is a proven and fun formula, but there was definite concerns on all parts of the team that the major downfall of this approach was that Batman would be really small. He would be this little tiny guy, on the screen, and he's kind of the star of the show. We should really be making him bigger. So we abandoned this Smash TV idea. We ran with it for like a 2-week push, and we created a playable demo of what it could look like. But it was like, yeah, it basically proved the assumption that Batman's too small. We're not going to continue in that direction, so scrap that. So the next thing we considered was this idea of a 3D moon engine. And the rationale behind this was we wanted the game to look as good as possible. And this was on very simple hardware. This was a 32-bit system. It had some ability to render polygons, but they were very, very basic. It could not render a lot of polygons. But it did have a CD, so we had lots of data space. And the idea here was that we would use this kind of pseudo 3D cards system to create this very rich kind of parallaxing fake 3D environment and that we would seek ahead on the disk and spool new rooms in so that we could have lots of nice graphical variety as this journey progressed. And it's funny because when you think about this approach, this is almost the exact same approach that Rocksteady would use in Batman Arkham Asylum, because Unreal 3, it has a very high level of fidelity, moment-to-moment sort of lighting and such, but it's not very good, or wasn't at the time when Unreal 3 came out, at doing large, expansive worlds. So it was a smart move for Rocksteady to say, hey, let's make a Batman game in mainly interior spaces, where we can use all of that rendering real estate to make those interiors look absolutely beautiful. So part of this idea for this sort of room engine was that, well, we'll do this room thing and we'll have these different elements. And one of the other aspects that we liked about this was that we could maybe get some detection mechanics in there. Batman's kind of a detective. It's kind of this sort of sleuthing element. If he's kind of crawling around these different rooms, that could be interesting to the player. But we wanted to mix it up a bit too, so we also wanted to have these vehicle stages. And we'd received early scripts from Warner Brothers of the movie. And one of the portions of the script that was a major action sequence in the story was a scene where the Batmobile drove up the side of a skyscraper and then drove on the rooftops of buildings, jumping from one building and then driving over the next rooftop and jumping off of that building, landing on the next rooftop, and so on and so on. And we're like, well, this sounds awesome. So we started working on this little sort of driving mini game where you were driving over the tops of these buildings and you would hit ramps and you would vault over and land on the next roof and so on. And we were like, well, this is, it's not great. Looks like it might have some potential. We spent a fair bit of time on it, probably about 4 to 6 weeks. And the feeling was, well, it might pan out if we kind of stuck at it. We're not really sure. And then the client, Warner Brothers, came back to us and were like, oh yeah, remember that whole building thing? Yeah, that's not in the movie anymore. And we were like, oh, fuck. We just spent all that time making this fucking roof thing, and now it's not in the film anymore? So there you go, lesson to be learned for licensed stuff. So meanwhile back to the room-to-room thing. So we're like, okay, let's put this rooftop thing on hold. We'll still play around with vehicles. Let's really double down on this room thing and kind of explore that a little bit more and what that could look like and feel like. So we did a lot of boards and panels on what would be happening, and these boards and panels matched up with the action and the cinema or the story as we knew it or understood it at that time. Here we can see Batman is on top of a vault that's been extracted from a building, and now he is fighting on top of the vault. More fighting. Then the chain breaks, and now he's falling. And now we had this idea that the player could be turning kind of as a rotational sprite and sort of flowing down towards the ground, just to kind of break up the monotony of the sort of 3D parallaxing rooms. There was a scene inside a sort of antiquated railway sort of system, or subway system, I believe. Here's a little illustration of, again, another vehicle stage, this time with the Batboat sort of heading towards an island. And then there was obviously the Batman as well. So we're kind of playing around with the idea that, okay, this rooftop thing's gone away, but, we should probably still have some versatile vehicle solution. So we can do some Batmobile something, some Batboat something, some Batwing something. There would also be sort of, times when you would sort of, go back to the Batcave and such. But we still weren't really quite sure about this whole sort of room exploration kind of thing. So we kind of paused for a moment and thought, well, is this really the right move, And so one of the things we thought about was, well, maybe what we should do is, as opposed to making the game a narrative journey, with a linear sort of progression of story, maybe what we should do is we should just make a really badass one-on-one fighting game, like Street Fighter. And at the time, there was products that were coming out like Virtua Fighter. And Virtua Fighter was, I believe, the first ever 3D polygonal fighting game. So we were looking at things like Virtua Fighter and we're like, wow, it's kind of possible now to make these 3D polygonal fighters maybe we should aim in that direction, but how could we make it a little bit more interesting? How could we differentiate ourselves from other fighting titles that were on the market? And one of the strategies that we came up with was this idea that as the characters were fighting, the action of them fighting could cause the world to degrade and for that context to change. So here we see this kind of virgin background here on a rooftop. And as the fighting would kind of continue, things would break, the water tower would fall over and smash, which would cause the ground to crack. Now the ground totally gives way and the players fall through into a room below. This is a total surprise to the players. Yeah, sorry, this slide's a bit long. So now we've fallen through into the room below. The players are still fighting in here. There's a fire raging on. One player knocks another player through the door, which falls off its hinges. Now they're fighting outside with Gotham as a backdrop on this sort of catwalk. They continue to fight, and now the catwalk breaks and they fall, and so on and so forth. And this is a concept that wouldn't really emerge in gaming until the birth of Dead or Alive 2, I believe. It would take many years later until people who made fighting games would consider the possibility that the brawl itself could have this accidental nature that would cause the brawl to move into a new part of the world, knocking someone off of a high building and then jumping down after them to continue brawling in the street below. So again, this was quite forward thinking, but as we dug into it more and we did more technical diligence against it, it just was not feasible with the hardware. We couldn't render a sufficiently detailed three-dimensional representation of Batman, especially because he had his cape, which would consume a lot of polygons and require some pretty elaborate inverse kinematic calculation to have the cape have motion and not interpenetrate his body and such. So there was long discussions about, well, can we take his cape off? And then Warner Brothers like, you can't take his cape off. And they're like, so eventually we're like, okay, fuck it, we're not doing that. So what we ended up doing was we ended up kind of combining and glomming a lot of all these so this time we've made essentially about 4 games of stuff. Not total scope, but in terms of the core idea. We wanted to roll all this stuff into this, this new idea, which was this co-op brawler, sort of Streets of Rage kind of idea. And again, one of the things that we wanted to do to make the game a little bit more deep and interesting was to add more variety to the moveset. Ordinarily, when you look at games like Final Fight, Streets of Rage, Double Dragon, the moves that characters could do were very, very, very shallow. You could punch, or you could kick. Or maybe you could do a way towards a kick and do some kick variant. You could pick up a pole and swing it at guys and club them in the hand. But there wasn't really much more that you could do. So what I did with these diagrams was I used a 3-dimensional basic mesh of a character to communicate these different ideas of these different moves. And if you look at the ground, and it's hard to see here, but you'll see these 3 sort of concentric circles. And the significance of the circles are depending on where an enemy is, whether he's here, here, or here. If the player pushed punch, it would generate a different move that was appropriate to that range. So if an enemy was right on top of me and I pushed punch, I might go douche. If the enemy was a pace away from me, I might punch them. If the enemy was several paces away, I might do a more elaborate punch or more elaborate kick. And this was our proposed solution to make the moment-to-moment sort of combat variety more interesting based on this kind of idiom of sort of Double Dragon and Streets of Rage. And it implemented very, very well into the game, in fact. It really worked out very well, and the characters were capable of doing a lot of pretty interesting and compelling moves, especially when we added in lots of other sort of gadget-based moves, like, sort of grapple gun attacks, and there's just all kinds of batarangs and various different things the player could use. By having these 3-dimensional representations of these moves made it a lot easier to communicate with the animators, because the game was being made with, at the time, absolutely bleeding edge hardware. We were using Wavefront, SGI machines. Like, and these machines were expensive. You know, they were like $5,000 for one machine. You had to get an electrician in to run a high voltage line into the building to even run these things. But the results they produced were pretty spectacular. You know, graphics like this back then were unheard of. You know, the only other place people had seen graphics of this quality was in titles like Killer Instinct, which also used pre-rendered sprite graphics. And this model was done by Cyrus Lum, who is a very well-known luminary pioneer within 3D detail modeling. Cyrus was a huge Batman fan, so this was a kind of a dream gig for him. So we created this, you know, side-scrolling sort of Streets of Rage game, and you know, one of the other challenges was we needed to really unify the look. So we have these three-dimensionally, you know, highly detailed, you know, characters. We put skeletons in them. We did all the animations. Everything had to be pre-rendered. Nothing could be rendered in real time. The hardware wasn't even remotely, you know, capable of rendering at this quality. Which is ironic when you look at Star Wars Battlefront now, or you know, Battlefield 4, or things like that. It's just a lot solid, just easy, you know. But to create this unified look, it meant that, well, shit, all the backgrounds have to be 3D. So all of our environment pipeline team, who used to draw sprite backgrounds, or who would make very low fidelity polygonal worlds or world chunks to make Turok games and things like that, now they needed to learn 3ds Max, and they needed to learn how to create extremely dense, polygonally rich environments. You know, pieces of newspaper, dented trash cans, light fixtures, poles, windows, and managing that amount of data on the antiquated hardware that we were using at the time was a huge challenge. You know, when we would load some of these scenes up, like say this street scene that you see in the background here with this window, there's televisions in the window which are showing animations. You know, it would bring these machines to their knees. You know, I mean, and, you know, it's just kind of a joke now when you look at the sort of polygonal power. But Sega and Warner Brothers came back to us and were like, hey, you know, we actually have this new hardware, the Sega Titan hardware, which is more powerful, has a lot more memory capacity and storage. It's Kleinot-based hardware, so it had a very, very large capacity ROM cartridge. So we could spool in these very, very highly detailed, completely unique pixel backgrounds and composite them together to create this, you know, journey of backgrounds that was all completely 100% rendered. Here we can see just a couple of boards in terms of sort of early ideation of, you know, just sort of gameplay, game flow. You know, the characters emerging from the Batmobile. There's a drive-by attack here where sort of thugs are driving by with guns. One of the elements was Two-Face had this kind of wrecking ball, so he would kind of play with the player with this sort of wrecking ball, dropping it on them and smashing it on them. You could destroy the backgrounds too. Here we can see this window here has been broken, so we would have to do damage states of these models. So we not only had to model the entire, you know, 2 city blocks that we were going to walk along, I had to go in and create a complete clone of that entire model, lift it all over here, which usually caused the machine just to crash. As soon as you selected the geometry and lights, you know, and said, hey, make a copy of that file, it's just like blue screen. You know, so artists would be crying and having nervous breakdowns constantly. Where it's like, it's going to be great, it's going to be great, just keep trying. You know, so they would get crafty about it. They'd be like, well, I'll cut it in half. You know, take half over, and okay, now I get another half and take it over. So they figured ways out around these things. But then we would produce these damage states too, you know. So it's like, well, what happens if we throw a thug through the window? Well, we need to have this damage state that needs to be reflected in the shadow detail. You know, so the shadows fall correctly within the geometry and so on. Here's another example of sort of background scenery damage. And it's funny in a way because this was almost a precursor to work I would do later on with Stranglehold. But this wrecking ball kind of swings from the back of the screen into the foreground, knocking these statues, which then begin to sort of topple over, and you know, the players have to avoid being crushed and so on. Players make their way towards the end and they sort of come up to this sort of biker bar, you know, where they're going to go down these staircase. But then, you know, Two-Face drops this wrecking ball on the bikers' bikes, and of course, the bikers aren't very happy about that. So they all spill out this bar, and now the player has to kind of, you know, take them all out. Descending down into the bar now, we have this sort of richly animated crowd in the background, you know, and the players would kind of fight their way through this kind of basement sort of bar. emerging on the other side, and I believe this is where they fought the sort of first mini-boss character. And then later on, sort of make their ways back up onto the rooftop where they were assaulted by this swinging safe, sort of pendulum style, which would swing through and try to damage the players from different directions, and sometimes it would kind of try to drop down on them and crush them and so on. And as if that wasn't enough, it's like, okay, well now I'm going to shoot with my helicopter guns, and then I will also drop off more bad guys. Before, for some mysterious plot reason, it made sense only to DC and Warner Brothers, flying away into the face of the Statue of Liberty. Which are like, who's writing this stuff? Yeah. Meanwhile, back in the Batcave, you know, the sort of Riddler's men have infiltrated the Batcave. The Batman and Robin sort of return back to the Batcave and knock them off the cliff edge. And again, this is actually going back to sort of some of that inking, penning methodology here, where the Batmobile was actually a cut-out paper element, and I'm redrawing. I'd photocopy the background many times, and then I would ink the movement of each of the characters and replace the Batmobile on each frame, and then run them all through the Xerox machine to kind of recomposite each of the frame of the documentation. The battle kind of moves on to this sort of gantry in the middle, and of course, it being a video game, bridge is always brave. They're told that never cross a bridge. They fall into sort of the bowels of the Batcave, this lower area, and you know, and thugs fall down too, and now we're fighting those guys and knocking them off the cliff in the background. Proceeding further into the bowels of the cave, it's like, hey, what's that? Is it a bird? Is that a plane? No, it's a fucking huge bat. And you know, then they get assaulted by this big bat thing that's flying around and biting at them, which doesn't really make a lot of sense because they're kind of meant to be his friend. But anyway, it's a game. You know, so pick the player up and bite on him a bit and drop him and get fall damage, and then they would do the sort of flat attack. Stephen Bromley actually worked on this particular character. It was quite complex because the bat was a real 3D animated object, so it was a polygonal skimmed object with animations interacting in a 3D rendered environment, so getting those elements to look like they actually composited together in the scene correctly was quite challenging. And then it has this kind of, you know, sonic, screechy sort of attack. I'm going to take a pause just for 1 second here to wet my whistle. So, after we'd finished Batman, which was a huge ordeal, and took a long time, we were given some time to think of some new ideas, some new games to propose, and at that time, you know, myself and my girlfriend at the time were super into like UFOs and especially the X-Files. Like, yeah, the X-Files. Did you see the X-Files last night? Oh man, blah, 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 that guy with a funny face and he went through a pipe. Just all the kind of weird shit they had in there, you know. So this was very sort of inspirational. So as a game designer, I was thinking, well, how can we take all of this zeitgeist? You know, how can we take all of this stuff that people are really excited about alien stuff, and make a game of it? And one of the things that I wanted to do was kind of turn the paradigm on its head. Because usually within games, you were always, you know, the strong human hero saving Earth from the aliens. And, you know, the idea is really centrally based around this idea of, no, fuck that. Let's be the aliens killing people. So you would start off and you would pick your different alien races, and different alien races would have different strengths and weaknesses. They would have different technology, different vehicles. You know, you would have your interior kind of briefing sequence on the bridge of the alien ship, where you would be given your sort of commands and orders. You could pick from a variety of locations and missions on the map. Here you can see the controls. They were really quite straightforward. You know, tractor beam, pause, death ray button underneath on the Z trigger, moving, and then up and down on the yellow buttons. Quite straightforward for an N64 game, but again, speaking to the A plus B equals D, what we'll see as we get into this is you can get a ton of gameplay out of this small footprint. So the principal idea was that you would fly this kind of little UFO around. So as I move my analog stick, the UFO is kind of moving around. The world's being viewed from above, sort of semi-isometrically. But if I push that yellow C button down, the saucer lands. And when the saucer lands, my guys get out. And now I can walk around the streets and I can start killing people. The score, as you can see, it's very blurry, is a death toll. So that's kind of how you were ranked, was how many people you were taking out. Then I get back in my spaceship and I would, whoop, I would push my yellow button up. I would go to this height of this sort of flying height. But one other unique twist was I could push that yellow up button again. And if I did this, I now proceeded up through the cloud layer. So there was essentially, it's kind of like Star Trek 3D chess, right? 3 layers of chess happen. A ground layer, an airborne layer, and then a sort of stratosphere layer. And the player had the ability to move between these layers at any point. And there was different kinds of gameplays occurring within these different layers. For example, in this top layer, we can see that the player's having to deal with Air Force. If the player pushed the yellow C button down, they would vanish through the cloud. They could then move behind the aircraft, come back up and attack them from the rear. So there was a lot of very emergent, simple gameplay that could be made just from moving the camera and how we observed these model states. The moves the player could do were quite simple, but again, you could do a lot of stuff with them. So you could kind of tap, your shoot button to kind of zap stuff, and, fry a couple of guys on the ground. And if you held it down, you could do this kind of more intense kind of Independence Day sort of death ray blast. But the part I was really all about and I liked the best was the tractor beam. And the tractor beam would basically let you abduct things. So, you would go over the object, you would hold the tractor beam button down, and it would start to rise up. And depending on the mass of the object, it would move either very quickly or very slowly. So you could pull items into the ship and you would get bonus points for that. But you could also abuse this power, which is the best part about video games. So you could pick someone up, but then be like, nah, I'm not giving you a lift, and drop them. So you look like that, You could also pick up heavy objects. So in this example, you can see I pick up a tank, and then I can drop it on his friend. So I'm using the tank as a weapon against the other tank. Or I could pick up the tank if I was in an urban situation, and I could start to use my analog stick. If this is the UFO that I'm controlling and I'm grabbing this tank, now I'm starting to use my analog stick to move my UFO like this, which creates a pendulum effect on the attached tractor beam vehicle. And that would in turn allow you to throw objects or smash them into other objects. And here we can see an example where I'm throwing the tank into a building. We also wanted this sort of sense of mischief, right? So like if you were kind of flying over the countryside, you could kind of mess with people and you could kind of mess with things. So you could fly over the countryside and be like, hey, I'm going to vacuum up this farmer's sheep. And then you might see this very lonely little farmhouse in the countryside, and now you're starting to rain sheep on this door, on this roof. The little light comes on the window. Farmer comes out. What's going on? Abduction. So you could do these kind of funny things. Again, built on these kind of very simple building blocks. And one of the other things that we wanted to do to kind of make it a little bit more interesting was this idea that you could shrink things. So you could pick up really big things, and then as you brought them up, you could actually shrink them, so you could bring them inside the ship. And this would be handy for later stages because you could then rebigulate those objects, very technical term, and you could drop them on stuff to do sort of titanic damage. So you could pull this thing out, just be like, drop it, just crush. Here we can see some examples of just some more detailing on, this sort of aerial combat and how that worked. And this work has never been seen in public, just so you know. Here's a little bit of detailing on what happens on player death. So, assuming that the craft has received sufficient damage, and this speaks a little bit to the sort of comedic nature again. He takes this bad hit from a tank. The saucer flips over, the alien gets ejected, and then, of course, the next thing that happens is the paparazzi. So you've got all these guys would flood out and start taking, take pictures around. As you flew around the world, you could recharge the ship's energy by being in proximity of energy sources. Airlines, power generators, radioactive mineral resources, And these things were touch points again to that sort of UFO zeitgeist knowledge of people always see UFOs around power lines. So it's like, well, let's put that in the game then. And here's just a little diagram of, the landed state. In the landed state, the player would command the central alien, so they'd be moving him, and the entourage would just move as a gaggle around him. Kind of like a conventional, old school 2D shooter where you'd have your central ship, and then these other attached sub-ships which provide more firepower. And it would be like, hey, people of Earth, come out, everything's going to be great, we'll share technology with you. Oh, well, maybe not so much, then we'll just set you on fire. Hopefully that's a serious one. So, unfortunately, we didn't execute the UFO game. It did go to the very top level of the company and receive green lighting from the Executive Review Committee for production. But we did not have an available team to execute the project, and we also had this other big opportunity coming up, which was South Park. South Park was a very interesting project as well. It was a very, very uniquely challenging project. And so it was an FPS game using the Turok engine, because that was the engine we'd spent a lot of time and money investing in. Excuse me. And it had full voice audio, so we worked very closely with Matt and Trey and the writers at Casabonita to draft a dialogue and script, and then have those guys record all that stuff, bring it into the game. It had to be bleeped, and it was a lot of work dealing with Comedy Central and Paramount and such. But the first game was, this deeply impacted document. And the problem with designs back then was they kind of looked like this, right? There were these huge Titanic phone books, and across the time that I'd worked in the industry previous to this point, I was beginning to see a trend emerge, which was I, as a designer, lead creative lead designer, what have you, would work with a team of other designers to produce these large documents, but the team wouldn't really use them because they were just too big. The data was just unmanageable, and they might turn to the page of the thing they were implementing and read it with detail, but there was weak connective tissue in the document because it was paper. So one of the innovations that we did when we made South Park was we basically pivoted away from this conventional method of production, and we made it all digital with rich hyperlinks. So I spent a couple of weeks and I hyperlinked the fuck out of that document. So it all had to be done manually back then. So every single little tiny microscopic talking point had a link to any other neurally connected relevant issue. So that the team members, when they were working on a feature, could easily jump 20 pages ahead to see, well, what moves or animations does this character have? What dialogue does he have? What act does he appear in? What stage does he appear in? And that really helped a lot. And the programmers and the lot of the team came back to us and were like, "Oh, thank God, you've actually made this a workable solution now." But South Park was very interesting. Around about the time that we got the South Park deal, The Spirit of Christmas, the student film that Matt and Trey had made, the very first kind of preview of South Park, had just been kind of virally leaked. People had seen it, people were getting excited about it. Comedy Central had kind of essentially bought them up and said, "Hey, make a season of this crazy shit. Just don't use a lot of bad words, just bleep them, but do kind of whatever you want." So the first few episodes of that season had just begun to screen on Comedy Central, and you could see the zeitgeist, you could see this is going to be a huge thing, but it wasn't huge just right at that time, it was just beginning to build momentum. So some sharp suit at Acclaim Corporate wandered their way over to Larry Lieberman's office at Comedy Central and started negotiating for the rights to South Park. And I believe we managed to acquire the IP rights to make a game of the brand for around about $250,000, which is an incredibly tiny amount of money. you know, even for that time, for such a license that would become a multi-million dollar franchise. The problem was all of this negotiation was going on around about March, and once we had that deal inked, we had to get the game in a box for November, because it had to be on the shelves in a matter of months, which is insane. I mean, even with a standing technology base, really insane. So we drafted one of the largest teams that we had at Acclaim Studios Austin to make the product. And I remember standing in front of the team and saying to them, this is going to be a hellacious project in terms of timing. In fact, it's very likely that we will all need to be here for the next 6 months, 7 days a week, to actually get the game done on time. And you know, some people had families and things like that. And I said to the team, I'm like, hey, if anyone, for any reason, you don't even have to tell us what the reason is, but if anyone needs to take a step back and walk away, this is the time to do that, because we need to configure the team and get going. And nobody did. Everybody was down with it, because everybody was really fanatical about South Park. So we're like, great, we have the deal, we have the team knows the team's expectations are being managed in terms of, you know, what we have to do to get this game done. Let's fucking get going. So we started obviously researching and looking at South Park and all these different episodes and coming up with different ideas. And we were going to use the Turok engine, as I mentioned a moment ago. And the idea was to, you know, create this kind of funny basic game with the different kid characters, where you would be kind of defending the town from waves of assaults from different kind of creature characters. And in the fiction of South Park, as it existed in season 1, there's a very famous episode where the children go hunting with their uncle, and they're carrying shotguns, and you know, it's like, it's coming right at me, blam, and they shoot a bunny rabbit, right? It's coming right at me, a sparrow, blam, and shoot the thing. So we're like, well, this will be fine, Doing an FPS at South Park, this is going to be fine, this will be great. We'd already communicated some of this stuff to Comedy Central, to Kaz Bonita, and they were like, yeah, this is fine. So we were making some progress. But then Columbine happened. And the moment Columbine happened, the world stood still. And basically it was like, wait a minute, we're making a game with children with guns shooting things. This probably isn't a very good idea. We were in deep shit, really deep shit. Because it was like, how the fuck are we going to save this project? How are we going to fix this? So there was a lot of people who were super worried about that for quite some time. And so we had to spend some time thinking about, well, shit, how can we save this project and get it back on track and craft a solution to this problem that doesn't change the technology that we're applying to the game. It still had to be an FPS, because that's all we had. You know, so basically we huddled on it, and we came up with the idea that, well, maybe what we could do is every weapon paradigm within the game could be a toy. So instead of your basic default pistol, you would have snowballs. Instead of a grenade, you would have a Terrence and Phillip doll, because anyone who knows South Park knows what they do, right? So you'd throw the doll, it would explode like cloud of fart gas, and people would take damage, you know. So we basically mapped all of those central weapon functions: sniper rifles, grenades, rocket launchers. We had a cow launcher, was our solution to the rocket launcher, which was hilarious, I might add, in multiplayer. You would aim the weapon at a friend in multiplayer, and you'd fire this cow launcher at them, which had a cow's head sort of looking around and moving out the barrel. You'd fire this weapon at them, and the cow would fly up in the air, and then it would come straight down on the opponent that you'd fired it on. But on their screen, what they would see is they would see the missile coming towards them, and then they would see the inside of the cow's bowels sliding over their screen as they went up its back passage, shall we say. So we had a bit of fun playing around with these things. So anyway, that was the solution, was, you know, let's use toys instead of these things. Everyone was like, Eureka, Eureka, time fuck. And the snowball was also funny because every weapon had a primary and a secondary fire. So you could throw the snowball, but if you held down the secondary fire button, you'd see the hand of the snowball leave the screen. You would hear a zipper noise, you hear a splash noise, and the hand would come back with a yellow snowball, which did more damage. So there was all kinds of opportunities to do cheeky fun things. But again, it was a huge challenge to sort of get it all done in the time. And because we only had a very, very small amount of time to make the game, the core loop, the core foundation of the mechanic of the game needed to be very, very basic. We could not make a complex game with lots of complex enemies. So it had to be really, really basic. And the central idea was that the players would enter the world and there would be enemies moving towards the town. There would be these larger enemies called tanks. And if the player let any of these tanks pass them and enter a kind of goal zone, they would then be tallied and moved into, these enemies are now attacking the city. So at the end of the stage, the player would now have to return to the center of South Park and you would see these large tank creatures pecking at and destroying the city. And if the city was totally destroyed, the game was over. So kind of a missile command idiom, danger coming in, trying to aim for this point and trying to destroy the danger before it actually touches that point. We had, an inventory of various different things that, the kids could use, all different gadgets and stuff. I couldn't not include this because this is probably the only time in my career I've ever done a state diagram for Saddam Hussein. We also had long meetings with Paramount and Comedy Central, and all these different stakeholders about the script, and it's like, well, should it say dildo here, or should it not say dildo, and can we say son of a whore, and what needs to be bleeped, and it was just this big, long sort of, back and forth sort of triage, trying to get this game done on time. But similar to the conventional Turok, the world was made out of these geometric instances that were kind of clipped together by designers that were assembled sort of jigsaw style. Now, I know we're kind of getting to time here, so I'll try and speed things up. The next project I worked on was a really, really exciting project that I worked on with Michael Hacken, who's sitting at the table there, which was called Hell on Wheels. And Hell on Wheels was an action brawler with vehicle mechanics set in an open world made using the Halo engine. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole backstory of how we had the Halo engine, that's another whole exercise in itself, but we did. We had the Halo engine, and we were using it to make this game. And here you can see some early models that Michael made, and then we sort of arced it up to have the HUD to illustrate to the publisher, hey, here's what we're going for, here's what it might look like. And after we got the green light, we formed the studio, which was Skynet. We started to really drill into this and use the Halo engine and understand, what is the Halo tech and how does it work and what can we do with it. And there was also a very large amount of planning that needed to go into this. Because we wanted to create an open world game, I spent a tremendous amount of my time planning these different open world maps and how they would fit together and how visibility would be managed. What is a city? What defines a city? How does traffic move through a city? How is a city zoned? What different functions do different portions of cities perform? Because we wanted to really capture this kind of sense of when you were moving through the world that it felt true. And this is all the same kind of diligence that Rockstar North does when they make a GTA game, right? To give you that moment-to-moment variety, that curation of the world. But it all starts with work like this kind of prep. Here we can see a more zoomed in illustration. This is vector art created from Word of a kind of an area where the bikers kind of hung out. So they could kind of do their racetrack thing, they could do stunt stuff, and then there was kind of this pit down here at the center where they could engage in various kind of activities. Here we can see an enemy-based structure again. This is illustrated in Word with polygons, illustrating an enemy compound that the players, as part of a mission, would break into and assault. Here we can see a schematic of the inside of that structure. So when the players do breach the structure and enter it, this is what it would look like on the inside. Here we see designed for a governor's mansion estate that the biker gang assaults, because you played these bikers in this biker gang. And here we see another example of a dockland area. And you can see at this point my vector diagramming skills have got fairly good. I could make some pretty complex stuff. And here's a selection of just a couple of screenshots of what the game looked like when it was running on Xbox hardware using the Halo engine. And it was fully networked. So you could play co-op, you could play versus, you could drive motorcycles together. This was also the first time that anyone using the Halo technology had implemented a motorcycle. Anyone who really looks at Halo tech, especially the first 2 iterations, will notice that there is no contact physics vehicle in Halo that rests on 2 wheels, because their technology would just cause the object to fall over. There was no sense of balance, right? So we had one of our programmers, a very talented young chap called Christopher MacArthur, take one of the Ghost vehicles, I believe, from Halo, and modify it into this physics representation of a motorcycle, so that we could actually have motorcycles in the game that worked and behaved like motorcycles.
He's now one of the lead engineers at Riot, right?
Is that what?
Chris, isn't he one of the lead engineers at Riot now?
That's right, yeah, League of Legends.
Yeah.
And here you can see the geometry. This is geometry that I made, I believe, in Maya, I think. Just using kind of crowdsourced textures from the web. At that time, the internet had been invented. So I could go to the internet and pull down textures and apply them to this kind of kit-bashed world. But even using this kit-bash idiom, the stuff looked not bad, for first-generation Xbox. And you could ride around the world and friends could get on the bike as well, or you could pick up these hot chicks, and who doesn't like having a hot chick on their bike, right? So after stand-up, I went up to Chicago to work and as part of the leadership team for John Woo Presents Stranglehold, which was a very, very ambitious next generation title on Xbox 360. It was one of the first ever titles to use Unreal Engine 3, which allowed advanced shading capabilities. It didn't allow for physically based rendering, but it was close. You could certainly do a lot of stuff that had never really been done before. And it was a very, very ambitious game with a very large scope. It was very complex. Originally, the game was planned to be an open world game, but after sort of months and months of pleading to the executive leadership team that open world and Unreal 3 were not good bedfellows, which they really weren't, they finally got it. They're like, okay, we'll drop the open world thing. Go ahead and deliver something that's a compelling, fun experience. And one of the big innovations for Stranglehold was this massive D system, which was this proprietary technology that we created to allow an excessive amount of physics damage to the world. And this physics damage was created in such a way that it would cause reactions in enemies, so it could be used as a weapon. So for example, if there was an enemy standing near a column shooting at me, if I shot him or missed him, but I hit the column, a piece of plaster that might chip off the column where my bullet struck would cause the enemy to wince, which would stop them firing at me so I could then finish it. Or I could collapse structures, I could damage the physics of the structure, causing it to collapse in a very elaborate, dynamic way, thus killing enemies. We also wanted very, very high fidelity characters in the world, as well as network play. There's not a lot of design diagram stuff that remains of Stranglehold, because most of the work we did was actually in the engine platform itself, grey boxing areas, playing areas, testing, iterating areas. But these screenshots give you some idea of the quality of work we were able to deliver. This character work and this environmental work that we did, considering it was a first-gen Unreal 3 title, is really a testament to the skill of the art team. We were able to pull off some really, really fantastic stuff. Let me show you a wee clip here of some massive features as an example. I think it will behave and play. Well, this was a cool video showing stuff getting blown up that looked kick-ass.
Could you give us a word diagram of that, a drawing?
Yeah, I don't know what's not working anyway. So next, I went on to Disney. Unfortunately, I can't really talk about the work that I did for Disney, just because of various NDAs. And I should also point out that the work that I'm sharing with you this evening, I'm very grateful to all of the IP owners who I contacted as part of this talk to gain their approval to show you some of this stuff. because again, a lot of this stuff's never been seen by the public before. So after Disney, Michael and Patrick Curry and Stephen Palmer and myself formed a new studio called Fun Machine, which is a mobile front-facing studio, and we worked on a product called Awesome Eats, which was a kind of puzzle, it's a redactive puzzle game for children, which taught children about healthy eating and vegetables and recycling and all of these kinds of things. It had many, many stages, and the principal design was based on an older game that came from Atari a while back called Clax. I don't know how many of you guys know what the hell I'm talking about, but Clax was a game with kind of conveyor belts that flowed towards the camera with little bricks that would kind of flip and flop their way, and you had to move them left to right to get them in the right buckets. And we really wanted to take this again and then kind of really blow it out and make it a lot more interesting. So when ideating on level design for Awesome Eats, I used a tool which is pretty much my exclusive visual development language now, apart from 3D, called Paper by 53. It's one of the best quick doodle iteration art packages that are available for the iPad today, and you'd be really amazed at the amount of visual detail that you're able to achieve with Paper. It's pretty incredible. But for quick doodle stuff like this, it works great. So I do these little kind of doodle boards of different stage designs, where each of these different colors on the belt is indicating a different behavior, whether the belt goes backwards and forwards, or whether it flows very, very quickly in a southerly direction or a northerly direction, where obstacles are placed. After that, we worked for a little bit, and I won't go into this in too much detail, we worked for a little bit on this kind of PvP networked castle game, which was a great game. But again, just to go back to the visual design element, Paper, again, was just this great tool for rapidly producing diagrams to explore different concepts of the game, who would play the game, how it would appeal to those players, different play styles. It allowed us to discuss kind of our design approach and things very quickly, as well as iterate on things like different gauge designs, fire kind of gauge designs, mechanics. Here we're looking at various different kind of swing meters, easy, medium, and hard, super hard. And then you've got this one, which would have been extremely evil, where every bounce of the meter causes the sweet spot to shrink. So I'm sure that would have had people shouting at us. You can also use Paper to ideate on analytic displays, because we were building an analytics pipeline that would allow us to display the data that we were capturing from users using the game. So again, Paper was a good way to create representations of the kinds of ways we would like to display the data that we could then use to communicate with the engineers as to what we wanted to do. One of the other projects that we worked on at Fun Machine was this product called Galaxies. And Galaxies was an educational product for middle school kids. And they engaged Fun Machine to do ideation for them. They wanted to sort of go for this space thing. So, you're traveling through the universe, you're acquiring this knowledge and so on. These are just very, very early kind of little doodle boards, as you can see here. But there was this sort of planetary theme to things. Students would navigate across this mosaic. They would have this spaceship. As they accrued knowledge, they would gain points. They could use these points to sort of enhance their spaceship. They would gather these knowledge particles. When they cracked these particles open, there would be activities within these particles that would be the academic portion of the experience. One of the challenges was creating a visual language for younger children to explain to them how they were performing academically across different academic tracks without using necessarily deep statistical representations. And this is the proposed solution that I came up for them, where this teeter board representation of the student themselves would indicate whether a student was doing well or poorly in certain academic areas at a glance. So a kid could click on the buttons at the top, tell instantly how they were doing in that sort of academic silo, but also have it be kind of amusing. Because whenever you deliver academic performance information to students, there's a possibility the information is going to be sad and demoralizing. So this was an attempt to try and kind of prop that up a little bit. One of the other products we worked on was this Wizard of Oz game, which was a Vil game, which we partnered with Spooky Tool on. I'd never worked on a Vil game before in my life, and this was a very large-scale project. But one of the things they wanted to do, which is why they engaged us, was to make these mini games, these kind of activities that players could do within the game world itself, outside of the Ville. And one of them was this Munchkin cannon game, where you'd have this cannon and you would shoot Munchkins out of it. So we wanted to build this smart. So what we did was we made 3 geometrical primitives, this big target, this little white one, and this little red one. And the plan was, by using these simple geometrical primitives, we could remix these geometrical primitives into different compound objects with different behaviors to create an almost unlimited amount of variety. And here you can see, although it might be a bit faint, different examples. And these are pretty much the exact stages that went into the final game. And again, I'm just doodling these out on paper. The client then came back to us and were like, well, hey, these targets moving around on their own looks kind of weird. So we're like, okay, well, we'll put these balloons on them so it makes a little bit more sense in the world. And then we had to add this kind of invisible collider around the game volume to cause the targets to kind of stay within the volume. These diagrams were produced to communicate with the client at handoff how the variables and technical structure of the game worked. So I basically produced a manual when we finished our work on the project to hand to the client to say, hey, if you want to change the trajectory of a Munchkin, here's the variables you touch. Here's what that variable actually does. So there's sort of technical diagramming as to how that was done. We also used paper to create sort of moment-to-moment difficulty progression graphs as I was doing the level work, so I could understand as I crafted different stages whether I made the stage much more difficult or much more easy. Here we can see an example of a very simple diagram just illustrating the difference between a PC mouse pointing clicking video and a tablet environment. Because here when I touch, the message box is obscured. And here I'm showing the desired behavior, which is that the message box should spawn above the point of contact on the tablet device. Another project that we did some ideation on very briefly was this rather bizarre brand called Chinese Character a Day, which is a website where people can visit each day and they can learn a different sort of Chinese character, so they can very slowly over time learn Chinese. And so we had these ideas for how this could become a game and sort of linking these bricks together and linking these blocks together. We even thought about it with this sort of awesome meets idiom of sorting the pieces into different areas. From there, we moved on to certain Affinity, where Michael and I worked on Age of Booty Tactics, which was a tablet-based game. And again, all these diagrams you're seeing are created in paper. But these are examples of just ideating on ship selection tiles, different tiles that can be above the ship to indicate status, as well as indicating kind of storyboard-wise, hey, when you tap on things and do certain things in the game, what do those things look like as you're tapping on them? Are there new markers or signals that are being generated on the board to communicate different behaviors to the player? Paper is also great for wireframing. My good friend over here, Maggie Duval, is a UX expert, and she and I worked very closely on all of the UX stuff on Age of Booty, and it was a lot of fun and very challenging. But this is just illustrating, hey, this is a great tool to use if you want to do any sort of UX, HUD, gauge design stuff. We also implemented a completely new element of the game, which was this card configuration, where players could use different decks of cards to configure their hand in different ways for matches to give them an advantage. The game was kind of fictionally set on this sort of globe of all these different locations, and we would explore these different locations later on. And as we ideated further into looking at how the game could be made more compelling, here we see a conventional sort of Age of Booty V1 tile, and here we see an illustration of, hey, this is how something could be made much more compelling. It's still a hex tile, but it's more geometrically dense, it has more geometry detail. And then finally, we're wrapping things up here, folks, I know it's getting late. This is a small selection of some of the things that I'm working on right now. I cannot show you too much of this due to confidentiality. I can't provide a lot of context on what these things are or why I'm doing such things or what problems I'm trying to solve, but I did want to include some examples of some of the things that I'm doing at the moment. That one is a multi kind of stage progression tile. And again, these are all produced on an iPad exclusively with paper. These slides are part of a presentation that I'm doing on the history of media, where we talk about every echelon of media communication and how it's impacted human growth and where it's going. And then we're down into the last 4 slides here. These are just some slides of some personal projects that I'm working on. Again, I cannot provide a lot of context. Again, these were created entirely in paper. But it's a great tool for quick ideation. And remember, the secret is doodle your way to victory. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, thank you, Neill. That's just mind-blowing. First of all, he spent a ton of time putting it together and contacted a bunch of people. It's sort of a history of the whole industry, and it's good you had...
Even that's the edited version.
Yeah, right.
Can you imagine the verbose version?
And I would have everyone take note of the fact he's got a bottle of Red Bull in his hand to get through that tour de force. Wow, a lot of ideas here. We're over by 20 minutes, but this is just phenomenal. We need to do a follow-up session. We'll talk about what to do.
More happy to do a Q&A sometimes if people have questions.
And the good news is it's all on, it's been streamed, but it's also recorded. And you can see it at Capital Factory Lifestyle. Tweet the bejesus out of this.
Okay, yeah, let me grab that.
It'll get around. I've been tweeting all night. And send it on out. It's going to be, look, it should be there. I don't know when they actually post it, but it's streaming right now. So thank you for coming. Capital Factory is a business incubator, if you don't know. And Obama was here visiting a few years back, and there's a presidential seal where it stood, if you want to go see it in the room. But that is one way to try to get you out of this room, because our commitment, they give us this stuff for free. And so we have to leave the campsite like we found it. So push your chair in like school. Put your pencils down towards the front of the classroom. And we just have to get the hell out of this room at 9 or they'll make it easy. But thanks again, Neill.